In 1942, the Atlantic was a graveyard. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, striking American convoys at will. They called it the happy time, their torpedoes tearing through merchant ships that never saw them coming. The ocean was theirs. To the German captains, American sailors were amateurs, too slow, too loud, too easy. Convoys crawled across the Atlantic like wounded whales. Each night, the horizon glowed with the burning oil of another ship gone down, but beneath that arrogance, something was changing. The Americans were listening not with eyes, but with sound. Their ships began to carry strange antennas, silent crews, and new machines that hummed in the dark. By 1943, the laughter inside the U-boats faded. Sonar pings echoed across the deep. Convoys stopped dying, and one by one, the hunters began to vanish. It wasn't magic. It was mathematics and radio waves. The Atlantic, once ruled by steel and torpedoes, was about to be conquered by sound. In the first years of America's entry into the war, the Atlantic wasn't just dangerous, it was doomed. German U-boats moved through the deep like predators in a Black Sea. They called themselves Wolf, the Wolves. Their commander, Admiral Karl Dönitz, promised Hitler that his submarines would starve Britain into submission before a single American boot touched Europe. He wasn't wrong, at least not yet. By early 1942, America's eastern coast was burning. U-boats surfaced at night, just miles from shore, torpedoing tankers silhouetted against city lights. Oil and debris washed up on the beaches of New Jersey and North Carolina. Civilians watched from boardwalks as ships exploded offshore, fire blooming on the horizon like sunsets made of steel. It was a slaughter. Each night, the U-boats radioed Berlin, their victory's entire convoys sunk, thousands of tons of supplies gone. They mocked the Americans over open frequencies, calling them clumsy sailors, floating targets, and children of the ocean. But deep inside those convoys, men were learning. The US Navy had never fought an enemy it couldn't see. Their destroyers fired blind into the night, chasing shadows and oil slicks. But slowly, painfully, a new kind of warfare began to take shape. At a small naval base in Key West, a group of scientists, engineers, and codebreakers worked day and night, surrounded by maps and humming machines. Their mission was simple: find the unseen. They built listening devices that could hear the ocean itself, microphones that transformed water into sound. They recorded the hum of propellers, the pitch of engines, the rhythm of pressure. They learned that each U-boat made its own signature noise, like a fingerprint beneath the waves. They called it ASDIC, an early sonar system. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of something terrifying for the Germans: detection. Meanwhile, Dönitz's wolves kept hunting. They moved in packs 5, sometimes 10 submarines, coordinating attacks on a single convoy. From periscopes breaking the surface to torpedoes streaking through the dark, every moment was planned with surgical precision. But their confidence was starting to crack. For the first time, U-boats began to lose contact with their prey. Convoys were changing course unpredictably. Merchant ships that should have been easy kills were slipping through the gaps. Then, late in 1942, the unthinkable happened. U-boat 223 disappeared. No distress signal, no wreckage, just silence. Berlin dismissed it as an accident. Then 2 more vanished. Then 5. Something or someone was hunting the hunters. Unbeknownst to Dönitz, the Americans had done something the Germans never expected. They had taken the chaos of the ocean and given it order. Using sonar, radio triangulation, and new cryptographic intelligence from Bletchley Park, Allied ships could now predict where U-boats would surface and when. They began to herd convoys through invisible corridors of protection, while hunter-killer groups roamed the seas like sharks that could hear blood in the water. The Germans still believed in luck. The Americans had replaced luck with data, and that difference, quiet, mathematical, and merciless, was about to turn the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a graveyard. By early 1943, the ocean had changed. It looked the same, grey, endless, eternal, but for the men beneath the surface, it had become something else entirely. It had become haunted. German U-boats still roamed, but their luck was dying. For the first time, the hunters felt hunted. One by one, their attacks were going wrong. Convoys weren't drifting aimlessly anymore. They were moving with purpose, always shifting course at the right moment, always escaping unseen traps. Inside the U-boats, superstition began to spread. Some said the Americans had underwater eyes. Others whispered that Allied ships could hear them breathing. They weren't far from the truth. Above the waves, the Americans had built a new kind of fleet. They called them hunter-killer groups, fast destroyers and escort carriers working in perfect coordination, each guided by sonar and radar. The sonar operators, mostly young men barely out of school, sat for hours in soundproof rooms listening to static. Every ping, every echo, every faint vibration mattered. Ping, pause, echo. Ping, pause, echo. Most nights the sonar was quiet, but when the rhythm broke, everyone froze. Contact! Bearing 175 degrees, range 2,000 yards. Within seconds, alarms blared. Destroyers swung toward the signal, depth charges primed. The captain barked, "Pattern fire, roll them deep!" Moments later the sea erupted. Explosions thundered beneath the waves, shaking the surface like a living heartbeat. The crew watched, waiting for oil, debris, anything. Sometimes nothing came. Sometimes the ocean bubbled black. Sometimes a single, twisted piece of steel floated to the top. Another U-boat gone. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz couldn't believe it. For months, he had dominated the Atlantic. Now, his wolves were vanishing faster than he could replace them. He doubled their patrols, changed routes, ordered radio silence. Nothing worked. Wherever they went, the Americans were already waiting. What Dönitz didn't know was that the Allies were reading his mail. Through British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the Allies had cracked Enigma, the cipher that controlled every U-boat communication. Each morning, before Dönitz's orders even reached the Atlantic, Allied intelligence had already deciphered them and sent convoys along safe corridors. The Germans were fighting blind. Their most secret messages were now guiding their enemies. On board U-boat U-402, Captain Siegfried von Leipzig had begun to feel the pressure literally. Every dive seemed longer, every patrol quieter. The ocean, once a safe hiding place, now felt like a cage. His crew barely spoke. When sonar pings echoed through the hull, the men froze like statues, afraid even to breathe. One night, as they surfaced to recharge batteries, von Leipzig scanned the horizon through his periscope. Nothing, just mist and stars. He ordered the radio operator to send a brief report, convoy sighted, bearing west. 30 seconds later, the operator flinched. "Sir, jamming." Von Leipzig frowned. Jamming? That meant someone was listening. He ordered a crash dive. The U-boat slipped beneath the surface, engines humming low. Then, faintly through the hull, ping, ping, ping. Sonar. The first depth charges hit seconds later. The crew braced as the hull screamed under pressure. Lights flickered, instruments shattered. The floor tilted. Von Leipzig clutched the periscope base and whispered, "How do they always find us?" He never got his answer. The next explosion split the control room in half. U-402 never reported again. Within weeks, 6 more U-boats disappeared in the same region, no survivors. The Germans called it the Silent Week. They couldn't explain it. They didn't know that high above the Atlantic, Allied aircraft were now fitted with airborne radar, capable of detecting periscopes and snorkels breaking the surface. The U-boats had nowhere left to hide, not even from the sky. Night after night, they were spotted, marked, and hunted before they even knew they'd been seen. For the first time, the Atlantic belonged to the listener. In the mess halls of American destroyers, young sailors began marking the sides of their ships with white wolf silhouettes, one for every U-boat sunk. The irony wasn't lost on them. The wolves who once hunted in packs had become prey, tracked and cornered by machines that never slept. By spring, the ocean was quieter than it had been in years. Convoys moved safely under the watch of sonar screens and coded radio nets. For Allied sailors, the silence felt like victory, but for the Germans beneath the waves, that same silence felt like doom, because silence, once their weapon, had turned against them. Spring, 1943, the month German sailors would later call Black May. For years, the ocean had belonged to them. Now, it was turning against them. In the first 10 days of May alone, more than 41 U-boats vanished. No survivors, no distress signals, just silence, the kind of silence that used to be their ally, now their grave. Admiral Dönitz stood in his command room, staring at a wall of radio frequencies that no longer replied. Every missing dot was a crew, a story, a wolf that would never come home. His officers avoided eye contact. Even the maps looked different now, the Atlantic no longer their hunting ground, but a battlefield filled with ghosts. "Find out how they're doing this," Dönitz growled. But no one could answer. The truth was brutal. The Americans and British weren't guessing anymore. They knew. Every convoy was now protected by an invisible web of intelligence radar in the air, sonar in the sea, and Enigma decrypts flowing from Bletchley Park straight to the Allied Admiralty. A U-boat's radio transmission, once its lifeline, had become its death sentence. The moment a German sub broke radio silence, Allied direction-finding stations triangulated its location within minutes. Destroyers were dispatched before the message even reached Berlin. The Germans still believed in stealth, but stealth couldn't hide from math. At sea, the transformation was total. American hunter-killer groups patrolled the mid-Atlantic, led by escort carriers that launched small aircraft armed with depth charges and radar pods. When radar spotted a periscope, planes marked the position with flares, then destroyers moved in for the kill. The attacks were mercilessly precise. Sonar contact, range closing. Hold course, depth charges ready. Fire pattern. The ocean would erupt in thunder. Dozens of charges sank through the water, detonating at preset depths. The blasts rippled through the black, bending steel, collapsing lungs, crushing the air out of men who couldn't even scream. Inside those metal coffins, the sound was unbearable. A deep, low thunder that shook the bones, followed by a silence that was worse. Some crews survived the first attack, only to die from carbon dioxide poisoning as they hid at the bottom, too afraid to surface. Others surfaced in surrender, only to be swallowed by flames from strafing aircraft. The wolves were dying in packs. One American sailor later described it. It wasn't war anymore. It was extermination. By the end of May, more than a quarter of Germany's U-boat fleet was gone. The survivors limped back to port in silence. The young captains who had once bragged of tonnage now stared blankly at the floor. The Navy doctors reported the same thing in every returning crew: uncontrollable, trembling, nightmares, and refusal to re-enter the sea. To the Germans, the Atlantic had become a living nightmare. To the Allies, it had become proof. Technology, coordination, communication had turned the tide. The once invisible enemy had been seen, tracked, and destroyed. In June, a small Allied meeting took place in London. An officer from the Royal Navy placed a chart on the table, a red line showing U-boat sinkings. It spiked sharply upward. He said only one thing: "Gentlemen, we have broken the back of the wolf." The room was silent. No cheering. Just quiet relief, the kind that comes when you realize survival has finally outpaced fear. But deep beneath the waves, not everyone accepted defeat. A few U-boat captains refused to stop hunting. Men like Otto Kretschmer and Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, legends of the Kriegsmarine, believed the tide could still turn. They modified tactics, diving deeper, using snorkels, staying radio silent for weeks. And for a moment, it worked. A few convoys went missing again. A few Allied ships burned. Berlin spread the news as proof the wolf still had teeth. But what the propaganda didn't mention was that for every convoy the Germans hit, 3 U-boats disappeared in return. The wolves were still biting, but they were bleeding to death. By the end of the summer, the Atlantic was quiet again. Convoys moved like clockwork, slow, steady, unstoppable. Radar towers scanned the horizon, sonar men listened through the deep, and codebreakers watched Dönitz's once deadly fleet crumble into statistics. Out of nearly 900 U-boats that had sailed during the war, more than 600 never came back. Their wrecks still rest there today, scattered across the seafloor like gravestones made of steel. Each one tells the same story. The ocean doesn't forget, and arrogance always sinks faster than iron. By late 1943, the Atlantic had gone silent, not peaceful, just empty. The sea that once echoed with the triumph of the wolf packs was now littered with oil slicks, bubbles, and names that would never be spoken again. For the first time, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his U-boats to retreat. The order came reluctantly, through the same radio network that had once directed their reign of terror. He called it a temporary pause. His officers knew it meant surrender. In the war rooms of Berlin, The once proud maps of the Atlantic covered in pins marking U-boat patrols were now bare. Each missing pin was a lost crew, each silence on the radio, a funeral without a grave. Dönitz walked past his staff, eyes fixed on the floor. "We were not beaten," he muttered. "We were deafened." He was right. The Americans had turned sound into strategy. At sea, their sonar operators had become musicians of war, trained to recognize every note of the ocean. They could tell a whale from a torpedo, a wave from a periscope, a German engine from a British one. To them, the Atlantic wasn't chaos, it was a symphony, and they knew every note. On destroyers, sonar pings became the heartbeat of survival. Ping, pause, echo. Each reflection meant depth, distance, direction, life or death in milliseconds. Every operator sat in darkness, headphones pressed tight, sweat freezing on their foreheads as they listened for the faintest whisper in the deep. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found death. One night in December 1943, a convoy was crossing the North Atlantic under cover of snow. The ocean was calm, the ships moving slow and steady. Then a blip. Sonar contact, bearing 185. Confirm, range closing fast. Destroyers turned. Depth charges armed. Engines roared. Moments later, the first explosion lit the waves. A U-boat had surfaced, maybe to escape pressure, maybe to breathe. It didn't matter. The instant its periscope broke the water, airborne radar locked on. A flare burst above, illuminating the Black Sea in white fire. The German captain saw it too late. Alarm, dive, schnell. But diving was useless. Sonar had already painted his position. The destroyers encircled him like wolves, ironic, now that the roles were reversed. The sea erupted again and again. When it finally went quiet, a slick of oil spread across the waves, glowing faintly under the flare's dying light. The convoy moved on. The ocean took another secret. By early 1944, Germany's once proud submarine fleet was no longer a weapon, it was a graveyard in progress. Even new models, faster and deeper diving, couldn't escape the eyes and ears of Allied radar and sonar. Technology had outpaced courage, and with every sinking, Dönitz began to understand something far deeper than defeat. He had believed that war was a contest of machines of armor, torpedoes, engines, and steel, but it wasn't. War was a contest of information. The side that knew first always struck last. In May 1944, an American escort carrier group intercepted 3 U-boats heading for the Caribbean. Their mission? To disrupt the convoys supplying the upcoming D-Day invasion. They never made it. The first was spotted by radar at dawn. The second was picked up by sonar before it even reached periscope depth. The third, after a 14-hour chase, surfaced to surrender, its crew climbing out one by one into the freezing air. The American captain watched from his bridge as the German sailors raised their hands. Among them was a young officer clutching his broken radio. He looked up at the destroyer towering above him and shouted, "How did you know where we were?" The captain didn't answer. He just tapped the headphones around his neck. When the war finally turned to Europe's shores, the Atlantic, once the world's largest graveyard, became a highway. Convoys moved freely, carrying tanks, planes, and soldiers to the beaches of Normandy. Every landing craft that touched French sand owed its life to the men who listened through the dark, who learned the language of the deep, and who turned silence itself into a weapon. For the Germans, the ocean had become an executioner. For the Allies, it had become a classroom. And when the final tally came, 784 U-boats destroyed, over 30,000 sailors lost, nearly 3/4 of the entire German submarine force gone. The wolf pack had been hunted to extinction. In the aftermath, the survivors of the Kriegsmarine would say that the Atlantic was never just water, it was memory. Every wave still carried the sound of sonar, the last heartbeat of those who never returned. And for Dönitz, sitting alone in his post-war cell, one truth echoed louder than any explosion. We ruled the ocean when it was silent, and we lost it the moment it began to speak. May 1945. The Atlantic was quiet, eerily quiet. The war in Europe was ending, cities were burning, and armies were collapsing. But far out in the open ocean, men were still fighting inside steel tombs. The last of the U-boats, fewer than 50, now prowled the deep, waiting for orders that would never come. Inside U-977, Captain Heinz Schäfer scanned the horizon through his periscope. All he saw was mist, the same mist that had swallowed 1,000 of his comrades. He had received no signal from Berlin in days, only silence, the kind that made men whisper. Then, faintly through the static of his radio, came the final order: cease. Hostilities, surface, await Allied escort. For the hunters of the sea, that message was death itself. Some obeyed, some refused, some sank their own boats rather than surrender. The era of the wolf pack had ended not in battle, but in silence. In the harbours of Europe, hundreds of submarines rose one by one, surfacing under grey skies with white flags painted on their towers. British and American destroyers watched from a distance, their sonar still sweeping just in case. In those final days, Allied sailors spoke of a strange feeling, not victory, but sadness. For years, the U-boats had been their invisible enemies, their nightmares. Now, as they watched the steel beasts rise from the deep, the men inside were no longer shadows. They were pale, exhausted, and silent young men who had spent months beneath the sea, hunted by sound and darkness. One American sonar officer wrote in his diary that night, "I almost felt sorry for them. They fought the ocean itself, and the ocean won." Admiral Karl Dönitz, now the head of what remained of Hitler's collapsing empire, sat in his office, staring at a map that no longer mattered. Every red dot, every patrol zone, every corridor, every convoy route was obsolete. He picked up a pen and circled the last U-boat, still reporting from the Atlantic. Then, quietly, he crossed it out. It was over. To the world, the war would end with parades and headlines. To Dönitz, it ended with silence on a radio frequency. For the Allies, the victory in the Atlantic was more than strategic. It was evolutionary. It was proof that war had entered a new age, one where the side that could see and hear would always control the side that could only shoot. In underground labs and secret naval bases, engineers who had worked on sonar, radar, and decoding machines were already planning the future. New systems, passive listening arrays, acoustic mapping, magnetic, anomaly detectors. The ocean was no longer a mystery. It was a grid, a soundscape, a world that could be mapped without ever being seen. One British scientist wrote, "The U-boat gave us fear, but fear taught us to listen, and listening taught us to rule." When news of the surrender reached the American East Coast, the mood was complicated. For 3 years, families had watched the horizon burn. Now, merchant ships sailed again, slow, proud, free. But the sailors who had crossed the Atlantic during its darkest years never forgot the silence between pings, the seconds where death waited underwater. In memorials later built along the coast, small bronze plaques bore the names of ships lost and, beside them, the names of the U-boats that had sunk them, enemies in life, neighbours in death. At sea, Allied destroyers gathered surrendered submarines in convoys of their own. British sailors described it as the strangest sight of the war. Dozens of U-boats, engines off, gliding alongside their former hunters under truce. Some captains saluted each other across the decks, others looked away. When the British boarded U-1009, they found a single message scrawled in chalk inside the control room. "The sea belongs to no one." It was a quiet confession, a truth every sailor knew. No matter who won, the ocean always took its share. The final Allied operation of the Atlantic campaign was called Operation Deadliest. Between late 1945 and early 1946, captured U-boats were towed into the open sea and sunk their twisted hulls, vanishing beneath the same waves they had once ruled. Some went down quietly, some exploded, scattering fragments of history across the seabed. Divers who later visited those wrecks said it felt like entering cathedrals of silence, massive, cold, still proud. Time had claimed them, but not erased them. Each hull still bore the shape of an idea, that arrogance could be engineered, that fear could be manufactured, that sound could become salvation. Decades later, when sonar operators of a new generation listened through their headphones, the ocean still spoke to them, not in voices, but in echoes. Some swore that, late at night, when the sea was calm and the sonar pings drifted long and slow, you could still hear faint noises from below, the metallic groan of a submarine long gone, the last whisper of men who had once ruled the deep. No one ever proved it, but no one doubted it either. Because in the Atlantic, memory never surfaces. The Battle of the Atlantic didn't end with a bang. It ended with a frequency, a final ping fading into silence. The ocean that once fed on ships and oil fires now stretched calm and endless, its only monument the rusted skeletons sleeping on its floor. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can still hear it. The heartbeat of the war that was fought without faces. The war of sound and silence. The war that ended when the hunters vanished overnight. When the war ended, the Atlantic slept, but the men who survived it never really did. To most of the world, the Battle of the Atlantic was over. To the sailors, scientists, and sonar operators who fought it, it was the beginning of something far greater, the birth of a new kind of warfare. The old wars had been fought with iron and courage. This one had been fought with sound, and sound had won. In the years after 1945, Allied navies gathered every secret they'd used to destroy the U-boat's sonar data. Enigma decrypts, radar schematics, acoustic fingerprints. They turned those secrets into something permanent, a system of listening. The Americans called it SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. Hundreds of underwater microphones laid across the Atlantic floor, stretching from Greenland to Florida, able to hear a ship halfway across the world. It began as defense to detect any surviving German submarines, but as the Cold War dawned, those ears turned east toward the Soviet Union. The ghosts of the U-boats had given birth to an empire of sound. For the men who had once fought the wolf packs, the transformation was surreal. One former sonar operator wrote in 1952, "In 43, we hunted submarines. Now, we listen for them." The war never really stopped. It just went quiet. And it was true. Every sonar ping, every echo, every transmission became part of an invisible front line. The Atlantic had turned from a battlefield into a surveillance network, a vast ocean of whispers, where every sound meant strategy. In Germany, the surviving U-boat captains faced trials, interrogations, and silence. Most never spoke publicly about what they'd seen. A few admitted that the war had changed them not because they lost, but because they realized how completely they'd been outthought. Captain Heinz Schäfer of U-977, who surrendered months after Germany fell, wrote years later, "We thought we were hunters. We were experiments. The Americans learned from our every movement. We were teaching them how to end us." It was a bitter truth, but an honest one. The same technology that had hunted them was now shaping the world that came next. The Cold War's nuclear submarines, stealth destroyers, sonar buoys, and communication cables all were born from the ashes of Dönitz's vanished fleet. For the Allied scientists, victory brought a different emotion, unease. They had mastered the art of detection, but they wondered what came next. If sound could find anything, anywhere, then nothing could ever truly hide again. One British researcher said it best, "The Atlantic didn't just teach us how to listen, it taught us that someone is always listening." Through the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, the technology that had once been a desperate wartime measure became the foundation of global intelligence. Hydrophones evolved into sonar nets. Radar grew into satellite tracking. Code breaking gave birth to computing. The Allies had discovered the single most powerful truth of modern war. Information moves faster than fear. That truth outlived every tank, every plane, every ship of the war. It became doctrine. It became policy. It became the difference between peace and annihilation. But for the men who had lived it, who had stared into the ocean and felt it staring back, the legacy was personal. Many couldn't return to the sea. Those who did spoke of the sound that haunted them, not explosions, not gunfire, but the endless rhythm of sonar pings echoing in their memories. Ping, pause, echo, ping, pause, echo. To them, it was the heartbeat of survival, the sound of an enemy they could never see but could always feel. One American veteran, decades later, summed it up in a single line, "I used to think the ocean was silent. Then I learned it just speaks a language we don't understand." Today, if you sail across the North Atlantic and drop a microphone into the deep, you'll still hear it. The echoes of propellers, whales, seismic shifts, and faint metallic groans of the U-boats that never came home. Their hulls still lie there, preserved by cold, claimed by pressure, surrounded by darkness. They're not just wrecks, they're reminders of what arrogance cost, of what innovation created, and of how silence itself can become the loudest sound in history. The Battle of the Atlantic was never about ships versus submarines. It was about blindness versus awareness. And in that war, the moment the ocean learned to speak, the outcome was inevitable. From that day forward, no commander would ever again lead an army without communication. No ship would sail without sonar. No world would ever again trust silence. Because the night the U-boats vanished, humanity discovered something terrifying and beautiful. That knowledge is power, and power is sound.